How I came to be the co-director of a water bar, I'm going to go back quite a ways. I grew up in a town called Palisade in northern Minnesota. It's on, I used to know the exact river mile. I think 1086 on the Mississippi River. A town of a population of about 160 people, varying throughout my childhood. Growing up in a town of that size on the Mississippi, we spent a lot of time in, around, on the river, but we never really thought about the river as part of our culture. I mean, that would have taken a level of thinking that, kids just playing out in the mud don't really have. But I learned to swim in the river, and I learned all kinds of things about the river from my family. Stories mostly about people and the things that they'd done and that the river had done. And I learned that it is a wild place that is very, very important, and that it contains a lot of things as well as stories. So that really sparked my imagination growing up. The other thing that was important about where we were, it was a place where most of us had never been anywhere else. My family was very poor. We didn't travel. We didn't even go camping, even though we lived in the place where lots of people went camping. So our interactions with the world beyond, and this was before we had satellites and cable TV, so we didn't even watch TV, and we didn't really read books. So our stories were our stories, and then we encountered people who came through. So the Mississippi, a lot of people will travel from the headwaters to the Gulf by bicycle, by canoe, sometimes driving the river road. So I met a lot of people that way because we would hang out in the park where we went swimming, and we would meet campers. So I did have a sense that the river connects us across space. So fast forward, I was working after college. I got a job at the Bell Museum of Natural History doing science and environmental education with art and film. And I was fortunate to work on a film project called Troubled Waters, a Mississippi River story. And what that was really a look at the interactions between land use and water quality in the Mississippi watershed. And as part of that film production, I was able to travel to small towns in Minnesota. A lot of them reminded me of the place I'd grown up. I also got to go to New Orleans and to spend some time with people in the Gulf, learning about the ways that the river has connected us all across that space and time, and then also how the choices we make here affect people downstream. So for me, that was a real aha moment, connecting back to my childhood. And I'm an artist. I'm a socially engaged artist. I like to create public art and opportunities for people to meet one another, to understand their own stories and tell their own stories. So my collaborators and I decided that we would try to create a bar that only serves tap water, and only serves tap water for free, as a way to tell stories about water and the ways that it impacts our lives. So we started doing Water Bar shortly after that Troubled Waters documentary, bringing it out to different events. Our bartenders were people I'd met in the making of that film. So scientists, researchers, advocates, farmers, they'd get behind the bar, they serve the water that they drink or that they work around, and they would tell people about that water. And they would answer questions, ask questions, and it became a social space. That was successful enough at sparking conversations and imagination that we started to get requests to bring the pop-up water bar to different places. We were brought to Arkansas, Bentonville, Arkansas, to do a 6-month water bar project at an art museum, working with college students to get them behind the bar, learning how to talk about the work that they were doing. And along the way, always dreamt about starting up an organization that would have a kind of permanent presence in our own neighborhood. So I live in Northeast Minneapolis, not far from Central Avenue, which is a really diverse and great place to live. I love my neighbors. I love talking to my neighbors. We were able to open up a storefront space, which we still currently have, where we have a tap water bar, a rotating group of volunteer bartenders, and then we host cultural and community events all about water, to, again, spark conversation, get to know one another, and explore the ways that water connects us.
What a wonderful series of things. I mean, it's start out with something right out of Huck Finn,
Yeah.
and I remember when that movie came out,
Mm-hmm. I didn't get into all the details about how controversial it was.
Yeah, no, I had a conversation walking across campus. There was an issue about where it was to be shown, and the person I was talking to said, "Well, if it can't be shown these other places, we'll show it."
Mm-hmm.
But let's get into that in a minute, because this first experience is really interesting to me. This small town, no place to go, but lots of people coming through experience.
Mm-hmm.
Just with an elementary question to start, you swam in the river?
Mm-hmm.
Was it clean enough that felt comfortable?
I mean, one thing that we talk about a lot at Water Bar actually is what is clean.
Yeah.
What is safe? What is risk? You know, these things change depending on where you are. We were told not to swim in the river, and the reason we were told not to swim in the river was more about objects in the river. We were always finding things, that people had thrown away. So for a lot of folks, the river is a way. It's a place to put your garbage, and that's been true for a long time, because water conveys those things. And so we were told not to swim there because we might cut our feet on glass, or we might snag on something, but that rarely happened. As far as the water itself, I mean, that part of the river's pretty muddy, I mean, it's like not muddy, but like tea, it has a darker color to it that's not sediment, but it just has a different color to it. And I don't think we cared, honestly, if it was clean or not.
And so what kind of swimming was it? I mean, I know these people, they jump in for 20 minutes and go out to the float and come back. And then there's somebody like Oliver Sacks who gets into the river and swims for hours.
Yeah.
He tells a story about stopping off on his swim to buy a house.
Yeah.
And then getting back into the water, that sort of thing. What kind of swimmers were you?
I mean, we were a group of kids. It was mostly my cousins and my friends and I who'd been told not to swim. And people think of that northern Minnesota being lake country, but we were in a swampy part. So we didn't really have lakes that we could swim in, and the lake shores were all cabin people. We weren't really invited to come out to the lake. So the river was where you went. And we had a rope swing tied to a tree. So part of the swimming was about daring one another to swing out over the water and drop in. We also had a railroad bridge, so the old Sioux Line Railroad went through my town, and in 1983 they stopped running trains. So it was a trail that people could take their ATVs or snowmobiles on, but the bridge was where we would play, climb up on the trestles, and we would jump off the bridge into the water. And the river wasn't very wide, but it was deep enough that I don't know how we determined the first time that it was safe to do that, but we did it.
The guy who jumped
yeah.
he came up again.
Somebody went down and came back up, but there were sandbars, that was a danger that we had to watch out for. And depending on the time of the year, the river could be too high or not. But in the summertime, it was usually pretty slow, and we were warm and we were bored. So
yeah.
It was that kind of swimming.
Yeah. So these people who were coming through the community, what kind of ideas did you pick up from them?
Well, one of the funnier ideas that I picked up, and I don't know how many of my peers were aware of this, but we were treated as if we were part of their vacation, in a sense. We were kids in a small town. The town was so small that a lot of people couldn't conceive of living in a place like that. Most of the businesses had been closed. So we were basically a gas station, a couple bars, a couple churches, and a bar and grill. There wasn't much going on. And so people would often ask us questions about living there. And we were, like I said, bored, so we were happy to entertain them or to connect or just, and so that one of the things I learned was that, we were different than the people who were coming through. Most of them were from far away. They lived in cities. They had the money and time to take a vacation, to take a long trip, to have a nice RV they were driving, or a canoe, or so those were some of the things. But then on a more positive note, I suppose, there were often groups of young people who were college age, who were coming through in groups, and they still do. I still hear of this quite a lot, in canoes or on bicycles, and they're doing something that they're really passionate about, and they're exploring the world. And that was really important for me to see as a young person, because no one in my family was really doing that. I was the first one in my family to go to college. I'm still one of only a couple of my extended family, cousins and such, to leave the town. So it was important to me to have been exposed to alternative futures, I guess.
So they were the equivalent of the train coming through.
Yeah, exactly. And we didn't have the train anymore, so yeah.
So can you say just a little bit about how you became one of the people who leave?
That's a good question. A couple of my friends who are a couple years older than me ended up going to school, finishing high school at the Perpich Center for Arts Education, which is a public high school focused on the arts. But it's unique in that it only serves 11th and 12th grade students from around Minnesota. They have dorms, so if you're from farther away, you can stay there. And I applied to go to school at the Perpich Center for creative writing and was accepted. And so I finished high school in the Twin Cities, and so that was really what got me out. I decided I wanted to be a writer.
So, I mean, both my kids went to Perpich.
Oh, really?
And so
when? Just curious.
And in writing. Yet.
Oh, what year? Do you know what year?
I don't know. They're both Shays, if that makes any difference. But so I know Perpich really well. It's one of the few organizations in the universe I have nothing bad to say about.
I had a very good experience there, so I would agree with that.
But I'm curious, I know how my kids heard about it, because they were going to big enough places that the word kind of filtered down and were close to there. But how did you get this impulse to think of yourself as a writer, to think of yourself as somebody who could even go to a place like Perpich?
Yeah. I mean, my dad is a musician, so there is a bit of art, going, and he's kind of an oddball in that place, in that, his side of my family has deep roots in northern Minnesota, but he had traveled a bit when he was young, and then came back, was playing at a bar outside of the town, and met my mother, who never lived anywhere else, and her family had been for a couple generations and rooted in that same town. So I think it was in part his influence. He wasn't really a reader. I mean, I do remember him reading science fiction, and he had things that he was really into, but he was sort of a wandering spirit still. He has a kind of sense about him. I think that was probably part of it. And then I was really, my friends were art and music people in school. I mean, I felt like kind of a weirdo, and those were the people I gravitated toward, and a couple of them decided to go to Perpich and were accepted, and I followed them.
And was your focus on environmental things sort of from the beginning?
No, not really. When I was there, I focused the writing that I ended up doing at Perpich, and because Perpich is really great at, I think kids who go there start to find their artistic voice sooner than others might. It takes a while as an artist to figure out what it is you have to say, or what direction you want to take your creative life. And I ended up writing a lot about the place I was from, oddly, because I think I recognized that it was a unique experience that I had had growing up in that place. And most of my friends at Perpich hadn't, they were from the city or they were from the suburbs. They also couldn't imagine my upbringing, so I ended up writing a lot about it. And because of where we were and who we were connected to the land and the water. I mean, our connection wasn't environmentalist in the traditional sense, but we spent most of our time outside, and my grandparents were farmers and hunters and outdoor people, and so I had that connection. But it wasn't until I started working at the Bell Museum that I think I really started to understand the connection between culture and story and environment, ecology, those connections. I think prior to that I really saw them as very separate things that didn't really, if you were a scientist, if you were a naturalist, you kind of were in one bubble, and if you were an artist, you were in another. But I learned from my colleagues at the Bell Museum that they're very intertwined, and a lot of naturalists are also artists. A lot of the experiences that people have with ecology that they end up writing about and sharing are very poetic and very rooted in the kinds of stories we tell that help us understand who we are and where we are. So over time I gravitated toward that. But I've always been also a little bit, this is like a departure, but a friend and I were talking actually today about this idea of beautiful soul syndrome and the sort of people who seem as though they are outside of these problems. They sort of situate themselves as moral purists, as their environmental choices are sort of part of who they are in a way that's very, to me, disconnected almost from the complexities of most of our lives. And so I feel like I work a lot with environmental organizations, but I'm also very critical of them. And I think there are things that we can do better in order to engage people in a way that will actually help them understand and live in a more resilient way.
It seems like this Bell Museum time was critical for what you're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
And can you say a little bit about how working in a museum changed you?
Well, that would take a long time to get into all of that. I know, we do. It's a big deal. I mean, it was a very, very big, important part of my life to have worked at the Bell Museum and to have worked with the people that I did and had the experience that I had there. I think some of the things were that I never had a real science education, in the sense that many of my colleagues at the Bell Museum had gone to school to become biologists, ecologists. So they had this real training and a real understanding of science and systems. I came at it from a completely different angle, right? Like I was like the kid who had grown up in the small town, somehow gone to college, ended up studying a random assortment of things, including cultural studies, urban studies, history of science. I took a really meandering path, but it never brought me through ecology. I never had formal science training. But I was really, really fascinated with science, and I still am. I think I get as much inspiration reading about research and about what we understand or don't understand about the world through science as I do about philosophy or art. And so being surrounded in people who are passionate about how the world works at that level, and who look at systems and who really care about life and the ways that we can continue to have diverse biological communities in the face of all of these changes that are happening, that was really inspiring for me. And now I think that my art making and my activism and even the way that I take care of my children and that I live my life are very much rooted in that ecological thinking, that kind of circular thinking, that it's all connected. Relationships are the most important thing. We have to be conscious about the ways that we build relationships and the opportunities that we have to connect with other people. That's the foundation for everything else. And that all comes, I think, back to that experiences I had working at the Bell.
What kind of work did you move towards as you were doing things at the Bell? What did you discover about the kind of work in the world you wanted to do?
So when I started at the Bell Museum, I was an intern. I was working through a program called HECUA, the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs. I was in their City Arts program, which focuses on arts activism, histories of social justice and art. And I decided that I was going to intern at a science museum. So my internship as a city art student was at the Bell Museum. And they had me work with art teachers at South High School to do a photography and writing project that was about urban nature. And sort of that was the first time that I really started to question our narratives about nature. The fact that we tend to separate people and nature, and we tend to think of the only valid experiences with the natural world that are worth writing about or worth fighting for are these pristine, natural landscapes that we preserve and we don't touch them. But really, so everything's been changed and managed by people. We can't go back in time. So we were working with high school students and trying to connect with the ways that they understand and find connection with nature. So I started there, and that was really, really a great experience. We ended up hanging the students' photos in the museum. We printed them really large and hung them up alongside the dioramas, and it was this interesting juxtaposition of ideas. But they also got to see their work in a museum, which I also really became captivated with how powerful it is to have our stories told in a public way, especially if we feel as if our stories are marginalized most of the time. And then we also had writing students from South, and I think maybe there were some Purpose students involved too, reading their poems at the museum, and their families came, and it was really, really wonderful. So the Bell Museum hired me after my internship and had me start working with their public programs division to develop what we called science and culture programs, which was really about trying to bridge these ideas of research science and popular culture. So I kind of became the person whose job was to make research cool and intelligible. So we launched a couple of programs. One of them was this program Café Scientifique, which brought research out into bars, actually. So I was like the host of that. And then we did a film program called Science on Screen. And that's where I started to really think about filmmaking. And then I also helped them organize a festival called the Bike In at the Bell, which is a music culture festival all about bicycling. And by the time I finished working there, I was working with the film production unit, doing documentaries. And so, and a lot of those were documentaries about landscape and the natural world. And so I think I would say I was lucky enough to be able to follow my curiosity, and they also gave me opportunities to try things even though I didn't really know what I was doing. I hadn't gone to school for public programming. I had never had a job in a place at all like that, and I had never made films when I started working on that, and I'd never done exhibits. And so I was lucky to be invited into these processes with people who had been doing it for quite a while, because they valued a fresh approach and thinking that I could bring. And so I think that's where I really started to see my skills and my capacities to try and experiment and iterate new public engagement ideas, because I was lucky to have bosses who would encourage that. Mm-hmm.
And what came to be your emphasis? I mean, what did you discover?
Well, I think the big thing, and this is now what I'm doing full time, is that the connection between art and science, and the possibility when you bring artists into science process or vice versa. So one of the things that I did in my final year at the Bell Museum was I started a program that they now call the Resident Artist Research Program. So it's a McKnight funded residency program where artists can apply to work at the museum and to create their own artistic projects in collaboration with the Bell Museum's researchers. And so we were able to experiment with that while I worked there. And that what we learned became a formal program, but then also I took that with me. And when I started my own independent art studio, that was really the big focus of our work, was to work to bring together collaborations between artists and science.
What's your art like?
I mean, I have a couple of different things that I think of as my art. I'm a writer, so I still do write and read and self-publish and do some of that stuff. And a lot of that is about the sorts of things we've been talking about. So land and people, culture, social ecology. I also, as a public artist, I work collaboratively with other people to create installations and social spaces. So some of the work that I've done is more traditional public art. There's some installations that I've helped to organize at public libraries where, you know, they have a more long-term thing. But then Water Bar is itself an art project. I mean, it's an organization at this point. We're technically a corporation, actually. But it is also an artist project in the sense that it's a form that I've created with other people to express different ideas about people, water, relationships. So,
as we were talking, the matter of controversy came up. I'm not sure how much we want to talk about that, but one of the high points of 24 years of doing this stuff was getting to talk to Deborah Schwackhammer about
yes.
her work.
She's wonderful.
With water and the kind of 20-foot target that put on her. She actually didn't say much about how complicated that her life was, but I know that it was complicated after she did the work she did. Mm-hmm. How was it with you and sort of, you're doing this, I mean, everybody likes birds, everybody likes those little deer they have behind in the diorama, and suddenly you're engaged with a documentary that people want suppressed.
I know.
What was that about? What was that like?
Well, first of all, I have to say that, my position in that filmmaking production was that, as an assistant producer, I was on the bottom of the the hierarchy as
so
things
you get
go.
To talk to the press.
Yeah, well, that's a long story. So I was along for the whole production. I was involved in the research. I was at all the interviews. I helped do cuts. I helped pull quotes. So I did have quite a role as part of it. But I also had, I was in this position of not really being in. I'm at the bottom of a chain of people who all make decisions. So when it happened that the film was, we had scheduled a screening. And it had been scheduled to air on Twin Cities Public Television, and then at the last minute, it was pulled. And we were told that it was because of one thing, and then we were told it was because of another thing. And it quickly became clear as more and more information came out that the reason it had been pulled was because someone in a position of authority did not appreciate the message. That's sort of what I understood, was that it had to do with the fact that the film maybe was too critical of certain practices. I don't think it actually was. I think there were a lot of things going on. And there were a lot of internal things going on, which I was privy to as somebody on the inside of all of it. As far as universities are complicated, research is political. Funding is political. Funding comes from, a lot of the funding for the university's agricultural research comes from large corporations that have a stake in a particular type of agriculture. And our policies, our farm policies are not always making the biggest impact. They might actually be contributing to problems. But I think that what I saw was just the highly political nature of research and communication, and how as staff who were not researchers, we realized that we weren't protected by the same intellectual what's the word I'm looking for? Like intellectual freedoms that researchers have. We didn't have that. So we could be told by someone that a film could or could not say a certain thing. So it brought up a lot of things that a lot of people were concerned about, and therefore there was controversy. I realized by the end of all of that I didn't want to work at the university anymore. I'd had a really good experience at the Bell Museum, and I was ready to move on after having, experienced how political it could be.
To phrase this very delicately, if someone were to give you a check for whatever it would take to remake Troubled Waters, would it be a more yourself in charge at the top of the pyramid? Would it be a more critical movie than the one that came out?
I don't think it could be in that context. I mean, as a production of the Bell Museum and of the university, it had to have a certain...
I'm asking though, I mean, if in your current state, where you're not in fact a creature
like
of
if
any
I
of
were to
these
make
guys.
a movie about the Mississippi River,
Yes.
would I be more critical?
Yes.
On one hand, yes, in the sense that I'm not afraid to say what I see and understand. I have no one, as an independent artist now and as someone who owns a business that is explicitly not a nonprofit, we are a business, we can say and do what we feel, that I'm not afraid to say that I think that our agriculture system is really messed up. I personally don't see that it is effective to point fingers in a direct kind of way. Like, I don't see my role as somebody who cares for water and wants to protect our water and protect our people communities and our other communities. I don't think coming out, like, there are many documentaries that are explicitly very activist, and they have a very specific... There was one that came out around the same time as Troubled Waters called King Corn. They take a really hard line about this is bad, this is bad. I think those things are important, but that's not the work that I do. What I have come around to is the importance of actually creating spaces where people can recognize and tell stories that are difficult and complicated. And that's getting back to the idea that I feel oftentimes as implicit or complicit, I guess, in a lot of the problems that I'm myself trying to understand and solve. I live here. I live in a city. I eat all kinds of food. I don't only eat food that it has been organically and sustainably grown. I don't think that I could afford to feed my family that way at this time. I'm not pretending that I have all the answers or that I would even, that's really my goal. I think that what I want is I want to see our communities create more spaces and more opportunities for us to recognize these complexities, and then to go from there to say, okay, if these things all are true, then how do we start to imagine a world that doesn't function in this way? Like, is there another possibility? I don't think we can get there just by being against what we see now. We need to actually be in a positive direction, imagining better futures. So I think that's where I would go with it. If I were to make a documentary right now about the Mississippi River, I would just want to hear all of the stories. I would want to hear the way that people connect to the river, the way they aren't connected. I would want to hear how climate change is impacting people's lives and imaginations. I would want to know about about how agriculture, the different ways that decisions get made by farmers on land, and yeah. That was a really roundabout answer, sorry. That's a good question.
We're frighteningly close to being on the same page. Tell me, please, a little about what happens at your water bar.
Well, a lot of different things happen at Water Bar. One of the things is that when we have our bar open, it is a tap water bar. We give away water for free. We talk to people about water and what we know about water, and we ask them to share what they know about water, and then things happen from there. We also host all kinds of art, culture, and community events that are loosely related to water. Some of them are very much about water. Others are, you might need to try a little harder to see the direct connections. But we're very encouraging of experimentation, of people trying new ways of working together. We want to be a space where it's okay if you try something and it doesn't work the way you thought it did. We're all going to learn together. And we also really, really try to bring together people who wouldn't typically be in conversation and help encourage them to hear each other and also to work together. So last night, for example, what happened at Water Bar, we hosted an event with a group called Healing Place Collaborative, which is an Indigenous artist-led group led by a Dakota artist, Mona Smith. And it was a social gathering. It was a bunch of people from all over the place. And we ate food. We had a potluck. Mona made bison stew. And we sat around a table and told stories. And mostly, at that point in time, I looked around and there were lots of different people at the event, but it was all women who were sitting around this table. And we were all sharing stories about, our journeys through as girls, the things we learned, how we, found our voice as artists and leaders. We were talking about all this stuff. And then someone was like, "Did you know it's International Women's Day?" And I was like, "Oh, I had heard that, but it was definitely not the focus." But while we were sitting around the table, I realized that this is the perfect expression of International Women's Day for me. It's like they were really women from all over the world sitting around a table talking about what we have in common. And so I think that is also a really good expression of Water Bar, which is that, when I feel like it's working exactly as it should, I look at the bar and there are all sorts of people sitting there, people behind the bar, and we're basically just having conversations about the things that are close to our hearts and top of mind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I can't imagine a more important space, and the fact that it's of necessity a sober space adds a really important element.
Mm-hmm.
You have to drink alcohol by and large to have that experience elsewhere in the culture. How does it work financially? How do you make a water bar work?
We are now accepting donations. That's a good question. People ask us that all the time because I think it is not exactly obvious. So we don't sell water. That's a decision we've made, and we give water away. So to a lot of people, that's like the worst business model you could imagine. Let's open a bar where all we have is water and we just give it away. But what we're actually doing is that we rent our space. So that's one way that we earn income, is other people can rent our space to do things in. We get hired by companies as well as organizations, schools, other groups as artists and consultants to help them do public engagement work and create media. So basically the work that we do as Water Bar is valuable to other organizations because they don't have artists on staff oftentimes. They don't know exactly how to engage diverse communities. We're learning that all the time because that's all we do in our space. And so we're able to offer to those corporations, some of them quite large corporations, other small community organizations, we can help them learn what we've been learning by coming and working with them, and we can charge them to do that, and that money gets fed back into the business. That's what pays my salary. Some of that is what pays our rent. We also have a fiscal relationship with our neighborhood organization, and also now with the Northeast Minneapolis Arts Association, where we can work with those organizations to raise money as they are nonprofits, so they can submit grants. And when they receive those grants, they can use those grants to do work in our space. So that's another way, and we can receive donations through those organizations for work that benefits their constituency. So people can donate to NEMA for Water Bar, and that money gets used to pay artists from NEMA's network and from Northeast Minneapolis to do environmental work with us. So it's a really hybrid model. There's, in some ways we're like a nonprofit, but we are actually we're a mission-driven business. We're technically a public benefit corporation. So unlike a traditional corporation, we're not operating for profit. We're operating for social benefit, and we define that benefit, and we track how well we're doing. And our public benefit, is that we serve water. Literally, that's what we do. But we also serve water in the sense that we work in service in our community through partnerships.
Some friends and I have roughly the same kind of corporation running for alarmingly similar purposes.
About water?
Not specifically about water, but about creating the sorts of spaces in which stories are told.
It's very important.
And our nightmare has been that to make it viable, we need to spend so much time in either grant writing or alliance building or outreach, simply to bring in fairly small streams of money. I mean, we haven't found a way to do the work we want to do, that is to make the spaces, to have the conversations, and also the putting on this tie and the suit and going and talking to people, one in 20 of whom will eventually engage with us. How does that balance work for you guys?
I mean, on one hand, similar in the sense that it's always a hustle. We do a lot of relationship building, and I would say that a large portion of my time is spent connecting with other organizations, companies, other individual artists. But thankfully I really like that, and it gives me energy, so it doesn't feel too cumbersome. But in terms of how that turns into a sustainable financial model, I mean, I think one of the things that we have going for us is that by having a water bar, it's a sticky enough and ambiguous enough idea that other organizations can see themselves in it fairly easily. It's like a fun, playful thing. They can pretty easily connect what they think we are to what they're doing. And so they might have the idea at first that we're a good way for them to just market what they do, because they can serve water and talk to people. That's what they want to do. That is part of what we do, but as I've talked, you can probably sense that is not all that we do. Having social spaces isn't just about promoting an idea. It's much more organic than that, and slow, and has to do with being strategic about what relationships you're building. And so we will work with we will bring our pop-up water bar to an organization or a company, and we'll do a one-time engagement, couple of hours, sometimes just for their staff, sometimes it's for a public event or a gala. But what we're doing in that time is also building up a conversation with them, where we're coming to understand where they're at and where they want to go, and then from there we can build proposals and projects that meet where they're at. And so it's like that's the kind of slow way in, and then over time we're building bigger collaborations. So on one hand, it's not like it just automatically works. We've struggled really hard. The last few years have been very difficult. We almost lost our space permanently because we couldn't afford it. We went for about a year without paying ourselves a salary. And so that was really, really hard. But I think where we're at now is that we're starting to, more of the people that we work with are starting to understand how we can work together, and we're being written into or brought into much bigger projects that ultimately, I would say in 2 years will be very sustainable if we keep on with that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it gives me hope. Let's put it that way. That efforts of comparable efforts I'm engaged with
Yeah.
might have that kind of success if we just stay with them.
I think the other thing is that it's counterintuitive, I think, to a business sense, to operate with total transparency and with trying to, I mean, I often try, I'm a connector and I'm an encourager, and I would say that more of my energy goes to encouraging other people and other artists and other organizations to do the things they want to do than it does to encouraging just myself, you know. I feel like I give a lot of energy back to the ecosystem that I'm a part of. And I think that at first that seems like a bad idea. If you're trying to grow a business, people assume that money is scarce or attention is scarce, and you hoard that and you protect your ideas and you don't share them, and you're competitive. I've done the complete opposite, in that I actually believe that if you are a person who encourages others and builds those relationships in order to support and sustain others, you're actually creating the conditions for your own success, because we don't do anything alone. We're actually not really good as people at doing things on our own. We actually need everyone in our communities. We need to uplift each other. And so by working in that way, it's slow. You don't see an immediate return on that, but over time you realize that when you need something, you know exactly who to call. They respect you. They have benefited from you giving them encouragement and energy, and so they're willing to help you. You know what they need, and they know what you need. You're part of a community. You're part of an ecosystem, and all of your success is interdependent. And so you're actually building the soil that's going to help everybody grow, including yourself.
So, how do you train your bartenders?
Well, we've been doing this as a kind of their training has been kind of ad hoc, right? Like we have documents that we've created that help prepare them to get behind the bar. And the main thing that we tell them is, to prepare, you need to be yourself. You know, prepare to be yourself. Come with what you know. Don't think that we can give you all the answers. You're there to share what you know, and here's some good questions you can ask to get conversation started. So most of the preparation is about starting conversations. Questions that we've learned over time spark good interaction. And then we also teach them simple bartending things, like, that you have to wash your hands, and here's how heavy a growler is when you're pouring it, and they practice a little bit. We will be starting a new program this year, trying to create a more formal bartender training, that will be a mix of Water 101. So some basics about drinking water and how it connects to surface and groundwater systems, issues of concern, and then it will be also a mix of that and cultures of water. So learning a little bit from the communities that we work with about how Indigenous people approach water. What are some words for water in Dakota or Anishinaabe? What are some of the ways that immigrant communities coming from different places around the world understand water? How can we incorporate that into our storytelling and in the ways that we engage? So we're really excited. We're going to be working with the Freshwater Society on that project, and it will align with their Master Water Stewards program. So we'll be creating a kind of water stewards program for water bartenders. So people who go through this program will be prepared to become water bartenders. They'll be able to work at our storefront or take it out into their own communities.
What sort of questions start the conversations?
The funny thing is that the best questions are often the most simple questions. So sometimes we'll ask people, what's your first memories of water? Like, what are some of your memories of water? What does the taste of this water remind you of? Do you have a favorite water that you've had in your life? What did you drink growing up? Where do you come from? What do you drink in your home? And things like that. So kind of asking people to reflect on their own experiences and perceptions. And usually that's enough to really get a conversation going. And then they'll end up asking questions, because what happens in traditional in environmental education is that people tend to be kind of guarded because they're afraid they're stupid. Because the messaging of organizations often makes us feel stupid. Not just stupid, but maybe like we're doing the wrong thing. And so we kind of tentatively approach these things, and if we see something and it's like, oh, that's for me, I love that organization, okay, we'll come up and start talking. But, you don't need to be told by that organization because you already believe as they do. So, but for anyone else, it might be like, oh, that's not really for me. I don't ride my bike every day. Oh, I buy bottled water. I must not be really cool with that. So, we try not to do that. We try to create a space where people are asked about themselves first, and then what happens is they'll start asking questions because they don't feel stupid asking them, because they know we're not going to tell them that they're stupid. So then they'll be able to say, well, I don't know where my water comes from. Or, oh, I didn't know that. Or, does our water have this in it? Or should I be concerned about that? And that's a much better place to start a conversation than with people feeling guarded or ashamed or not like they don't belong.
Now I'm imagining these interactions as the bartender and one person. Is that how it usually goes?
It can. A lot of times people visit in groups with their friends or their families, and so there'll be a bartender or two bartenders and then a big group of people. And that's another thing that is really fun about it, is that some of my favorite conversations are actually the ones that happen between people who visit. So there might be a group over here and a group over here, and we encourage the bartenders to try and start conversations among groups. So you'll end up having somebody sharing a story over here that sparks a story over here that sparks a question. So we do water bar at the Minnesota State Fair. We did this last year and we'll do it again this year. The Minnesota State Fair is interesting because you get people who are from all over Minnesota, and they all are passionate about things that they love. So we ended up having an instance where we were serving a water from a small town and a water from St. Paul, and we had people at the bar who were from St. Paul and people who were from a small town and drank that same sort of well water, and they got into this like lighthearted argument about who had better water, the city or the country. And that was just like an interesting example of, these are people who probably aren't going to be sitting at a bar together anywhere else. They don't go to the same bars, they don't drink the same things, they don't necessarily even ever cross paths, and they might cross paths at the fair, but it's not to talk to one another. So we were able to create a situation where they could talk to one another, and then they end up sharing all other types of stories, and hopefully they walk away with a better understanding about difference.
And how long do people stay?
It just depends. We encourage people to stay as long as they want to. At our bar, at the storefront, people will come in and just hang out for as long as they want. Some will come and just quick get a drink of water and go. It really depends. But we do have, like at the state fair, we took a time-lapse video, and people sit down for 5 minutes, which is a really long time for an education exhibit. So it's cool to see that.
So 5 minutes would be about the average at the fair, and longer in your storefront.
Yeah.
So a half hour maybe?
Yeah.
It's sort of an average?
Yeah, it depends on whether and what kind of conversation they end up having. Sometimes, we have people come in because they're bringing family from out of town, or they have a specific thing they want to talk about, and they'll hang out as long as they feel welcome to, I guess.
It's kind of a big jump from producing documentaries where the button at Minnesota Public Television, when it gets pushed, produces images in some millions of homes, to one-on-one, day after day, in a storefront. And I've gone back and forth in my own work between those two ideas. What have you come to feel about those ways of working? You've done video, you've done this broadcast stuff, and you've done this slow, one person at a time relationship building. How have you come to think about that?
I think for me personally, both of those ways of working are important. They kind of fit, I was talking earlier about a kind of ecological mindset, or a way of thinking that's fundamentally about an ecological circular way. I see them kind of feeding into one another. So sometimes I think about the bar as research, in a sense. I've created this fairly elaborate and pretty expensive way of hearing stories that I wouldn't otherwise get to hear. So I get to be kind of a fly on the wall. I get to be in a community. I get to hear people share things about themselves. That inspires me when I go back to write. I've got a series of poems that I'm working on right now that are all about, specifically about women that I've met in my travels with Water Bar, and who are doing work that is about healing relationships. And, those are stories that I wouldn't have heard if I'd only been thinking about making a film. If I wasn't creating a space where I could myself be embedded in community. So to me, it is really, really important to create those spaces, because those are the spaces that I need for my creative life, and also, like I was saying before, to be resilient, we need to have relationships with other people who have different skills and perspectives and resources. So I also have benefited a lot from having the Water Bar as a place to build relationships. I've made new friends and connections that have really, really helped me through things that I've had going on in my life, for example. I don't think you get that as much if you're just producing films. Although the thing about filmmaking, about documentary filmmaking, that I love is that I get to go out and hear people's stories. So actually those are one-on-one experiences. They just end up being amplified, to more people. But yeah, I think they're very similar in that way.
So, I'm just thinking, you've chosen to make the start prompt for the conversation water.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any chance that sometime in your future you might broaden it to trees?
Tree bar?
or dirt?
Is it always going to be?
It seems like, I know for a fact that trees work. That everybody has a story about a tree.
Yeah.
Just to mix it up. Is there something magic about staying with, we're serving water, we're going to talk about water?
I think there's a lot to talk about. I think that my lifetime isn't going to be enough to exhaust water as a topic for conversation. So on one hand, I think that's really the direction I'll be working in for a long time. But I do, in other projects, we use different topics. I'm working on some research for a public art project right now about mining, which does connect to water. But, the prompt there is that we want to create a mobile overlook. So a lot of the open pit mines up on the Iron Range have overlooks that you can climb up and look. And there's a sort of logic to taking in the landscape in that way that tells us something about our power as human beings to alter those landscapes. I want to create a mobile overlook and take it around and have people climb up and look at the landscape and talk about it. So once again, that's not water, that's a different prompt, but it's a similar idea in that I'm creating a unique social space where people will hopefully feel they can tell their stories.
And this idea of doing preliminary discussions in the direction of a public art project, a construction, is that something that you also want to continue? Or?
Yeah, I think that there's a misconception that artists oftentimes create out of nowhere. Like this idea that bing, a little light goes off and I know what I'm going to do. I don't think most artists work that way. I think a lot of us are taking in information, ideas, iterating. I work with a lot of scientists, and one of the scientists I work with quite a lot, she's doing a research project about mining, and she wrote a grant to the National Science Foundation, and she wrote me into her grant so I could go along on her research trip. So I went along like a fly on the wall to listen to the interviews she was doing, and now I'm proposing a public art project that will amplify her research in a creative way. And that process I'm sure I'll continue for as long as I can, because it's how I work. It's, the way that I get to an idea.